Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today, we're going to continue our discussion about life, like kind of the basics of life. And today, we're going to talk about something about what's called the organization of life. Um, and so today, we're going to talk a little bit, expanding about how we organize things that are living versus different levels of complexity of living organisms. All right. And so today, I'm going to use this diagram here and as we go through kind of different levels of it. And I'm going to talk about it in a second. I want to talk about it in a second, but I'm going to pause just for a few seconds. So if you have your handy dandy notebooks out, you can copy down this little diagram. So I'll pause right now. Okay, I hope you pause the video because I'm not just going to stand here while you do it. So, okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this here, and there are lots of different diagrams. This is the one I kind of chose. It's a very common one here. We're going to talk about a different level of things, building blocks, building up to how we organize or we describe life, complex life like ourselves. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what is living versus non-living and the characteristics that all living things have. But if we think about it, everything is made up of something smaller. And at some point, living organisms such as ourselves, we're made up of non-living things, which is a little bit kind of tricky to think about. It's like, we are made of non-living things, and non-living things together are making something that is alive. All right. And so how we kind of break that down here. And the one thing I like about this chart here that's set up like this is because the size. All right. Which I like to draw it this way. Some people even draw kind of the opposite of this, like turned upside down. It just depends how you're describing it, but it's all meaning the same thing. I like to do this here because whatever we're going to fill on each one of these tiers. All right. Notice the one at the very bottom is very big because this one is the most abundant. We talk about the most abundant thing in the universe here when we talk about on this planet or other life. All right. Most abundant. It's just it's abundance, just a fancy word for the most of it there is, which makes this, of course, then the least abundant. And it's kind of that sliding scale here as we go up in that direction, all right, or from most to least, or vice versa. But because it is the most abundant, you could also say that it is the simplest. All right, I always like to think of life as in terms of like Legos. Right, you have lots of little Lego pieces, and you can make them into more complex structures like houses and boats and things like that. But if you use all those Lego pieces, you're not going to have as many boats as you do individual pieces. So these are going to be much more simple, less complex. All right. Even though they're more abundant, the ones closer down here are going to be less complex, simpler. While the one all the way up here, because we're using these building blocks, and we're using these building blocks to make this, and then those building blocks to make this, and then this to make this, to make this, to make this, so on and so forth, we're building up more and more. This is obviously much more complex. By complex, I mean it can do more things. All right? And so we kind of have these two scales here. We have two scales. We have to go on from, the direction, however you want to think about it, where we start with very abundant, very simple particles, and we're going to end up with less of them, but more complex beings. All right, and so we're going to talk here. So we're going to talk all the way at the very, very bottom. We're going to work our way up. We're going to start from very simple and how we go up. And then in future lessons, we're going to talk about how we believe the theories of how we went from something very simple and less complex into creating much more complex things. Into at some point, we go from non-living things. Some point here, we're going to reach the point where we go from non-living to living. All right. So let's start with the very simple one. Let's start at the very bottom here. It is the most abundant thing in the universe. It is the simple property of all things, and that are atoms. Those are atoms. Atoms are the fundamental building block of all things in the universe. All right, there are parts of an atom, right? But they are the building block of all things in the universe. All right, you learned about different types of atoms. You have the periodic table that shows the different types of atoms that we know of. All right, these are the building blocks that build everything else. Right? They're the basic Lego pieces. All right. When we talk about life, right, eventually, because that's obviously we're talking about the organization of life. There are some more that we've found that are more abundant and necessary for living organisms. Those being carbon, oxygen, or hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. You could probably include sulfur and phosphorus in there as well, but these are kind of the core ones. These are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. These are what we consider a lot of the fundamental atoms we need for life to exist. More complex in life needs more atoms, more different types of elements. The easy way I remember it is just chon, CHON, chon. Those are the fundamental elements or atoms that we need. Again, we do use more sulfur, phosphorus, but those are kind of the essential ones to kind of get us started. From that, we know that, first of all, atoms are non-living. Right, so we're starting at a non-living thing here. They are not alive. They do not meet any of the criteria for what we consider characteristics of life. Okay, from atoms, we move on up. We can start combining some of these atoms, putting a couple Lego pieces together. And what we start creating is a molecule. We start creating molecules. Molecules, whether they are, since all of these are non-metals, ones that are mostly formed were formed through covalent bonding. Remember, that's sharing of electrons between two non-metals. All right, you start getting things like hydrogen gas, which is H2, and carbon dioxide, and methane, CH4. That's one carbon with four hydrogens attached to it, and you get like ammonia. Ammonia. NH3 with nitrogens connected. You start getting all these different molecules here. All right. So now we're starting to take little individual atoms. We're combining a couple of them together to make molecules. All right. Now there's this one point right here that I actually want to kind of. A lot of people don't include it on there, but I'm going to include it. You could say kind of at this, like kind of this highest level right here. All right, I'm going to add one right here, like a little mini level. You can eventually create something called macromolecules. Macro being the prefix meaning large. So then we can go from atoms to make molecules, and we can take these molecules and make bigger molecules. If you combine actually all of these ones here, including an oxygen gas, you start creating the fundamental building blocks for proteins called amino acids. All right, so you're just creating bigger and bigger and bigger pieces. With these macromolecules, let's change our color here. Once we build our macromolecules here, we're ready to have our first organelle. All right. This is when we're building organelles. Organelles are structures found within cells that provide some sort of function. Some of the ones you're probably most familiar with are like the mitochondria, chloroplasts, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi body, the nucleus, the cell membrane. These are all ones that we're going to be talking about. These are made up of lots and lots of molecules and macromolecules working together to perform some sort of function. We're going to talk about those. So examples would be like the mitochondria or the chloroplast. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about some organelles in the next couple weeks, but just kind of giving you an idea, we're building up bigger and bigger. We're using now macromolecules working together. Our structure is getting more and more complex, but we are still not dealing with living things yet. Organelle is not alive, but it is a fundamental thing we need to have life. All right, that first basic unit of life. If I can have atoms building molecules, building macromolecules, building organelles, and those organelles working together, create the fundamental basic unit of life, the cell. All right, the cell. basic unit of life is the cell. At this point here, we are now in living territory. All right, let's do it in, we'll do brown, I guess. All right, so once this point here, we've reached this point. All right, we are becoming much more complex. All right, as we kind of go up here, we went from non-living, and all of a sudden we've put enough non-living things working together to create something that is living. Right, so everything down here is non-living, everything up there is living. We get more complex living organisms or things. All right, it's the basic unit. It could be unicellular organisms. It could be simple types of cells called prokaryotes, or we could have more complex multicellular organisms, or we can have more complex cells that have various different types of organelles, which we call eukaryotes, which we'll talk a lot more about. But at this point here, we are at the basic unit of life. Basic unit of life. All right, everything on that is building onto this. If I have cells working together now, they can perform. Individual cells can't do as much, but if they start working together, they can start performing a lot more complex things. All right, I have muscle cells all over my body. A muscle cell doesn't do much by itself, but when it works with the other ones to perform a similar function, then we have something called a tissue. All right, tissue is muscle tissue, skin tissue. These are all cells that perform a similar function and thus can work together and do more complex things. A muscle cell by itself can't do a whole lot, but a bunch of muscle cells working together can move my body around. All right. So now we have tissue here. If we have tissue working together, I can create different tissues working together, even more complex. Now we start getting organs and organ systems. Kidney tissue working together the kidney does multiple things. It filters your body. It's kind of like your body's filter or a Brita, right? It has different parts to it. They're all different tissues. Those tissues work together to do an organ function. In that case, a kidney function, which is about kind of filtering your body, along with the liver as well. All right. And when we do that, we start getting even more complex organisms, which we could say, let's just call this organisms. You could sneak in here organ systems, right? There's a couple ones you could sneak into, a couple of ones, depending on which organization life chart you look at. It might include a few main things. Notice I didn't put a top on this because you could include populations, communities, ecosystems, biospheres, Earth, right? We could keep going as we go on this here. The whole idea is being about this very basic, less complex, very abundant atoms and building something. And eventually we hit that level, all right? That level where we go from living to non-living. And we go from these non-living organelles working together to create a living basic unit of life, the cell. And then we start getting more and more complex things as we go on from there. All right? So that's kind of a little bit of how we organize life. Again, if you type in organization life, you're going to find 100 different pictures, 100 different diagrams, but they all follow the same principle. Some people put organisms down here because they're the biggest, and some people it adds up here because they are the smallest. It's all the same principle. Understanding, in the end, about which ones are the most abundant, level of complexity, and that level of that idea of building. We're going to spend a lot more time talking about that building, to create much more complex things, to create much more complex structures and functions. All right. So I think that's going to be it for right now about the organizational life. Again, if you feel like you just copied this, exactly what I did down, and you still don't feel like you understand, then you need to go back and watch the video again and add to it any notes that maybe I said, but I didn't write down on the board. Just because I didn't write it doesn't mean it's not valuable. All right. I'm not going to write an essay on the board about all the different facts, but if you feel comfortable, good. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Good luck, and may the science be with you. Bye.